Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to Pangolin, the conservation podcast, the show dedicated to exploring and amplifying the world's underappreciated conservation stories. The stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. I'm your host, Jack Baker, and for the final time this series, welcome to Pangolin Pride, our series highlighting voices and stories from the LGBTQ plus community. I know, I can't believe it's the last one either. I'm very, very upset. But looking at what we have done so many amazing things. We have explored the worlds of wildfires in California. We have explored sloths in Costa Rica, gibbons in Borneo. We have learned how people deal with being out in the field, how we can stand up to homophobia and transphobia online, and how we can make the wildlife, nature, conservation space more welcoming and inclusive and accessible for everyone. And now, for our final episode, I am joined by the absolutely incredible, wonderful, brilliant, intelligent, just wonderful person to be around and speak to, the incredible Christine Wilkinson, to discuss how being queer is natural. Christine is a researcher, advocate for amazing causes, and science communicator who has a real interest in the natural world being queer and how that is incredible and all of the amazing forms and species this is present in, and it's just wonderful. We talk about their journey into this world, what queer ecology is and why it matters, and some examples of queerness from the natural world. Which means we get to talk about lizards that reproduce all on their own, fish which can change sex, lesbian seagulls, same-sex sexual behaviour in cattle, we talk about rats, we talk about Fossa, we talk about hyenas being absolute queens and legends and just incredible, wonderful things. And we get to talk about whales doing what whales do. And so look forward to that. Alongside those things, of course, we also talk about all kinds of other amazing things. I've really just scratched the surface here, and that's what makes this episode, I think, so exciting and so special, and why I'm so grateful to have been able to open up Christine's brain and just look in for a moment at amazingness. It's just brilliant, and yeah, I'm so excited you get to experience it. And yeah, I think it's the perfect way to wrap up what has been a joyous, wonderful, lovely celebration of Pride this month. And yeah, I'm really sad that it's almost over, but yeah, we're going out on an absolute high. Thank you, of course, to Christine for their time, and of course, thank you to all of you for listening and supporting the show throughout this series. I'm so grateful. It's been so wonderful to see the warm reception it's received and all of the kind of love and support that is out there for these amazing people and these amazing stories. And yeah, it's just filled my heart with joy and love. And yeah, before I get too emotional, just thank you. You are beautiful, brilliant, and all of you are just incredible. And if you're out there thinking, I don't belong in this space, or conservation isn't for me, I hope this series has helped to show that, yeah, we want you here, we need you here, and you are brilliant and needed and important and wonderful. And on that note, thank you so much again for tuning in. For the last time, happy Pride Month. Thank you for a beautiful series. Thank you. And without further ado, let's get started. And welcome back to the show. I am now joined by Christine Wilkinson, a returning guest who you may remember being here a few months ago, years ago now, to talk about hyenas. Well, they are back again to talk this time about their Queer is Natural video series and some of the amazing kind of stories that have maybe come through that, maybe some other ones that will surprise us. But either way, I am just so excited to have you back, Christine. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's very exciting. I don't want to put pressure on you, but I'll tell you now, you are the season finale, so you are the last guest that will have this series. And I thought it would be good because we started. We've talked about all sorts of things. We've talked about humans. We've ventured into the worlds of sloths and gibbons and things throughout the series. But I thought it'd be good to kind of bring it all back at the end to the animals themselves that we usually talk about, the nature itself that we talk about. And I'm so excited to do that with you. I think it's going to be absolutely fantastic. Um, but before we talk about all those things, I do think, in case people haven't listened to our episode about hyenas, which they should have, because it was one of my absolute favorites. And I think it's, yeah, not to big up your ego too early when we get started, before we get started. It's one of our most listened to episodes of that series.
Nice.
Yes, I think fantastic. Getting the love for hyenas that they deserve. But before we talk about all of the amazing animals and things that we will do, I also think it's important, in case people haven't listened to that, to introduce you once again, even if it's maybe briefer than last time. So yeah, do you want to reintroduce yourself to the listeners? Tell them who you are, what you do. Yeah, just a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. I am Christine Wilkinson. I am a Schmidt Science Fellow based at UC Berkeley and at the California Academy of Sciences, both of which are in the Bay Area of California. My work is oriented around conservation science. In particular, I talk a lot about human wildlife interactions, our relationships with nature, environmental justice, and how that intersects with those things, and of course, queerness in nature as well.
Yes, which is exactly what we're here to talk about today. So I think perfect introduction. And I think it segues really nice into the first question, which I was going to ask, which is obviously like, we'll talk about the videos that you make, we'll talk about the kind of animals and the species and things that you've talked about. But I think to kind of precede the whole conversation, what might be useful for people who maybe are like, what does queer is natural? What does that mean? Can nature, like, how do we apply that label to nature? How do we think about nature in this way? Like, I think it would be really good and important, I guess, to talk about what you mean when you say, like, queer is natural. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, so I think that the ideas that have been promoted in Western science, which is our dominant model of science in this world, because it's not the only model, are largely about basically putting things into neat little boxes and putting them into these things that we can draw very clear lines between, thereby ignoring the copious amounts of gray space and nuance that is a very fruitful space to explore in nature and otherwise. Um, and because of the way that Western science has been set up, and combined with people's taboos in different cultures, and the way that there are certain types of scientists throughout history and not others, the idea of there being things like same-sex relationships in a lot of different species, like I think over 1,000 species have been documented to have same-sex sexual activity or behaviors or relationships of some kind, or having things like sex changing ability, differences in what some scientists call gender roles within different species, more than just the two sexes. So I think that we haven't really heard about those stories very much, partially because Western science, sometimes in some cases we can talk about later, has actually squashed those stories on purpose, or has discouraged people from studying things even when they're right there in front of us, and should be studied because that's one of the tenets of Western science, I would say. But also because people have been discouraged from really finding that lie between the lines, which is why there's this lens called queer ecology, a set of theories that it would take ages to explain. Lots of people have different takes on queer ecology, but in short, it's about really appreciating that nuance and finding that lie between those lines. Um, and in this case, what I'm really interested in, as my sort of epically burgeoning side project that I started in 2022, is understanding more about how that plays out in the animal kingdom.
hmm I think it's really interesting, right? And it's something that, like, yeah, it always shocks me when, I mean, it's simultaneously, it's nice to see nature stories in the news, but it always amazes me, right? Like, where thing. Like, I think it was it humpback, because I remember earlier this year, like last year, there was a story about humpback whales being like, there was kind of same-sex kind of behavior recorded, and it was the first time that humpback whales, I think, had ever been recorded having kind of this behavior. And the media and general public lost their minds, right? Because they're like, oh my goodness, like, not only is there whales doing things that we haven't normally seen whales do, it's not what we imagined that it would be. It's because it's not the lens that maybe, people expect to look at the world and look. And it's simultaneously like this thing, right? Of like, it's nice to see people talking about these stories, but it's also kind of like, why is this so shocking? Why is this so surprising to you? It's very bizarre, right? Like,
It
yeah.
is, and especially since we've now known for quite a while that having these sort of heterosexual binaries in nature is just not even close to the truth. I mean, like, even just going beyond animals, like, think about plant sex for a second and like how absolutely bonkers and complex that is. And people kind of don't think about that, are there because they're not encouraged to think about that, or because they're scared of thinking about what that could mean for viewing the world in a new way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's yeah, and then don't even get started on fungi, because then we get that enters a whole other world of confusing but interesting but bizarre, like, things that I think would, if you can't accept whales, the fungi is going to blow your minds, because, like, yeah, maybe that's a whole other episode. I need to do it another time, because, yeah, it gets more even more complex and strange and interesting with them. Um, but yes, I guess, like, that also kind of leads into a question that I was going to ask you, which is kind of what inspired you to start talking about this more publicly and creating content around it and videos around it. Like, was it this kind of like thing that people don't know and you wanted to kind of promote it more and get people thinking about things differently? Did you want to kind of, as we were talking about, the lens of science hasn't really focused on these things, like, we've been encouraged to not look, like, and did you want people to more actively look? Like, what was it that kind of the factors that influenced you to try and promote this and try and turn attention onto it a little bit?
Yeah, honestly, like, the first thing that sparked it for me was that I was really tired of some of my core family members who are very conservative and homophobic.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard them and other conservative folks try to assert that being queer is unnatural. So my goal with the series, coming from my scientific background, was to go against that falsehood and demonstrate that, queerness, like homosexual behaviors and gender bending and sex changing, is found throughout the natural world in, again, over 1,000 species. And those are the ones that have been documented, and is even extremely common in many species as well. So I wanted to create a series that speaks to how inarguable it is that queerness is natural. And doesn't say it with any sort of political qualifiers, on purpose, right? So if you watch my videos, I'm presenting to you the papers, the evidence, the science, the fun facts around what we know of these behaviors, to make it an inarguable video, on purpose. And part of that is because it's just, a lens that I find to be critical, I think, for some people. And sort of watching people turn the tables on themselves if they disagree with queerness, right? And just sort of watching them, almost sort of put their foot in their own mouth, trying to politicize the science, is something that is an uphill sort of battle for folks. Whereas, like, if you present political views within these videos, I think it would, cause the sorts of discussions that I find to be not as productive and more hot air and anger. But I do just want to say, like, despite the fact that this was catalyzed by, like, me being tired of folks being homophobic against queer people, I really think it's critical to remember that we should not have to demonstrate or prove the countless examples of queerness in nature in order to prioritize basic human rights for LGBTQIA plus people. Also, I was just going to say, like, scientific framings in that realm are really sometimes can be compelling, I think, for folks, who are not homophobic, who are promoting, LGBTQIA plus rights, but they've also been weaponized already a lot of times. Like, people who have sought out the quote unquote gay gene aren't all doing it to be able to be supportive. right? They're doing it for these nefarious reasons. So I think that just we shouldn't have to use these scientific lenses and all this evidence of other species in order to just have basic human rights and equity and safety for all different types of people on this planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's the thing, right? Is like it's this, like it's it's really interesting to have these conversations and to kind of promote and say like this is really interesting and this is kind of, but yeah, it shouldn't. Hopefully, if you're listening to this and you've been listening to the whole Pride series, hopefully you're not one of these people who have had to listen to have things proved to them that they need, that like, that people deserve respect and like care and love just because like something, oh, we've finally got proof that it's natural. Like that shouldn't be the case. um Maybe you are listening to this and you have been convinced of that, and that's wonderful, and I'm glad that you have been. But yeah, I think that's a really really important point to make, actually, a really really important point to make. And I think that's kind of also what I like about the videos, going back to kind of the non-political, non kind of like, it's just the science. What I like about that, it's there's multiple reasons I like it. I think the first kind of few that I saw, like I like the videos on a base level because like science is often inaccessible, right? So like just opening up and being like, here is everything, not everything you need to know, because I'm sure there's lots more reading people can do, but here is a lot of on one topic, the science behind one thing in a condensed kind of like minute to 2 minutes, kind of like here it is, making it accessible and interesting. But also, yeah, it's just presenting fact, which I also really appreciate, because as like, it's not looking for an argument, it's not looking for a fight, it's not looking for like, it's like, this is this and you can take it and you are now informed, and what you do with that is then up to you. And I think that's really really interesting and important kind of way of kind of, yeah, just presenting information, and then people can do with it what they will. And like, I think it's really really exciting and interesting, really really interesting. um yeah, I guess like when what you were kind of talking about in the beginning, and I guess here is like, you kind of talked about like, oh, the science obviously like avoided telling these stories for a long time, and then obviously it was this kind of spark of like, maybe like you got tired of like listening to people say things that were ignorant or wrong, like, and then that maybe like started you creating these things. But like, I think in that case, like, what made you want to do it in this kind of non like I guess, oh, I mean, I guess you answered this already. Like, I was going to ask, what made you want to do it in this non-political kind of just factual way? Was it just the kind of like, yeah, was it that kind of spreading of information and just getting it out there, kind of, yeah, and
Yeah,
like,
it was like my way of sticking it to people, right?
yeah,
Like here are pieces of inarguable
yeah,
fact,
hmm,
and you have to do the legwork to make that political
yeah.
and look at yourself in the mirror as you're doing that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, actually. And like, yeah, if it makes you mad, that's on you. You've taken that and you've made yourself angry about it, or made yourself this or that, because it's just fact. I think is a really interesting, yeah, positive way of doing it. Um, and I guess like, yeah, then I think that's really, really interesting. And I guess then like, moving on a little bit from that, like, you then had this idea, you then started kind of coming up with these like, I'm going to tell these stories in this way. How is it you then went about kind of like, I'm intrigued to know like, when, as you said, science hasn't allowed necessarily certain stories to be told, and it's getting hopefully better and easier to find these things now. But like, how did you go about deciding kind of like, I want to tell this story, I want to research this, or I want to look into this that I'd never maybe been able to find before or seen before? Like, what, how did you start to begin to like, yeah, find those stories and decide this is the one, or this is what I want to do, or like, yeah, when it's been so sidelined for so long?
Honestly, it was tough for some of the species. So like I was sort of looking up, examples in the news over the past forever of species that exhibited same-sex behavior, or in scientific literature. And for some of these species, there is very little peer-reviewed scientific literature. I mean, there's some that there's a bunch, some there's one or two papers maybe. Um, but I began to find these sort of hidden resources to be able to understand these, and not so hidden, but sort of, right? So for instance, one that was less hidden, that I like discovered sort of, I don't know, maybe 10 animals into this journey of making these videos, was that there's sort of an encyclopedia on queer animals called Biological Exuberance by a man named Bruce Bagamil. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I'm never sure if I'm saying that right. That nobody seems to be able to find this man, who did some amazing work. Basically, I think this book came out in the late 90s, going around finding scientific literature about all these different species, making an encyclopedia, a sort of very thick, small book, and also not just looking at peer-reviewed literature, but calling around scientists, asking them the things that they've seen in the field that they haven't logged, either because there was only a couple of instances that they saw of it, or it wasn't what they were studying at the time, or it wasn't what they were being funded for, and logged all of these different species that he could find or hear about, in this sort of compendium that I'm sure would absolutely be a joy to update by someone. And so that's like sort of this surprise that happened in the middle. It was like, oh, this is like a thing that someone has thought about, a mysterious hero of a man who no one seems to be able to find. And so that's an example of like hidden, maybe, because like nobody told you about that textbook when you were a kid. But even more hidden are things that are, for example, I learned that the homosexual behaviors of cattle have been well known by the livestock industry for a very, very, very long time, and included within like cattle management and husbandry white papers and manuscripts and manuals are ways to harness that same-sex behavior for your cows to get them to, mate with something, some object or something, after turning them on with like another animal of the same sex. And then that way you can like do artificial insemination, or you can, just a bunch of different ways that they use those behaviors for one of the largest industries in the world. And to some extent, for perhaps one of the most right-wing industries in our country, the USA, is using same-sex behavior as husbandry. And so like, that's what I mean. Like, that's not in scientific literature as much, but it's all over these management white papers. Another example that I actually didn't realize until some of the comments on my TikTok about velvet horn deer, white-tailed deer that kind of are intersex, and usually males that grow horns, they have this velvet on their horns and they shed it after the first year, and these don't. And they also have like, different types of behaviors and sort of genderized, like not really mating and whatever, that kind of thing. And maybe different types of genitalia that aren't clear sometimes. And so I think someone wrote on my comments, a few people that are hunters wrote that the hunting tags for deer in their states, I don't know which states they were, I forget, actually like make that ambiguous. Like they write horned versus not horned, rather than like male versus female, because velvet horns are such a common occurrence. So that's like another example of like, wow, this has just been here the whole time amongst these vast communities of people or practitioners, and the rest of the public doesn't really know about it.
That's really, really interesting, actually. And I think it's interesting because it's like, it's kind of this like I'm still blown. The cattle one really like it's interesting because just like going to the like, not to politicize it, but it's that thing of like, it's funny how these things are like, when it's useful, we'll use it, but we'll not talk about it, but we'll not like, when it's like but then not study it, not like talk about, like, there's so many things about that are just really interesting, like kind of bizarre but interesting, but kind of like, this acknowledgement but not recognition in other aspects, and no kind of critical reflection on maybe what that means wider than for business. Like that is, it's really,
I mean, what
interesting.
you're catching on to is the fact that free market capitalism infiltrates every aspect of what we do. I mean, like, you know, that even just the way that science, Western science, has played out over time is linked to that. It's not just linked to the patriarchy, although they are hand in hand, I would say. Um, yeah, I forgot what I was going to say, but you get the point.
Yeah, and I guess that actually links in to something I was going to ask about, which was just while you were thinking. Obviously, those are like the examples you gave are kind of, and the comments that you've gotten, and the kind of things that you've mentioned there were obviously like very like US based examples, and kind of I wondered if also alongside the kind of and the textbook as well, obviously kind of written by somebody who works within kind of it seemingly, if we can find out whoever they are, wherever they are, maybe works in Western kind of academic. Did you look beyond? Like, do you have to look, or have you looked beyond? I imagine you probably have, because like the kind of classically Western academic canon, and like looked beyond into more kind of indigenous or traditional knowledge and stuff as well.
Yeah, honestly, I haven't been able to find a lot, at least online, in that
Mm,
realm.
yeah,
Um, I think there's a lot more to learn, right? Like in my
yeah,
videos, I've only covered maybe 20 to 30 something
hmm
animals of the thousands that we know of.
yep.
So yeah, that's a really great point. I'm certain that this must feature somewhere in
hmm
indigenous lore.
hmm Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. It was just one of those things that came into my head of like, oh yeah, like beyond what like the yeah, I guess like yeah, but then at this point, I feel like yeah, I'm currently doing my PhD and I'm getting like more and more bored of reading classically proper in inverted commas academic in inverted commas Western like yeah because it does exclude so much and it does exclude so many stories and interesting things, so it would be interesting to kind of yeah look beyond those realms as well and kind of see what's out there and what knowledge already exists, because it's bound to be out there. Somebody will all know all these things and like hopefully be able to tell these stories one day more kind of yeah more kind of formally or more kind of yeah widely. I think will be really, really interesting. um and I guess then like that moves us on, I suppose. Like we've talked a little bit about like yeah like where it came from, what you kind of did, like where you find the information, and like I guess that kind of then leads nicely again onto like talking about some of the species themselves, the things that have stood out, the things that have kind of the stories that maybe you've enjoyed kind of learning about the most, the things that have jumped out of being like particularly interesting to you. Like what were the kind of, if you kind of yeah what are some of the stories or examples or things that you've kind of looked at? Is there one that like you want to start with of like this is one that is really, really interesting and I loved, and like yeah there's so many questions there, but I'm sure you know what I mean. You just take it from there. What were some of your favorites or things that you've looked at and learned?
So hard to decide,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're everything is amazing. I
Yeah.
love the natural world. I think sort of an icon and one that actually helped me to learn something really new was the New Mexico whiptail lizard, whose entire species is made up of females. So they reproduce through parthenogenesis, which means virgin creation in Greek. And so their unfertilized eggs develop into an embryo. But a couple of cool things about that make it a bit different than what you might think parthenogenesis is. So first of all, like the coolest thing is that the offspring aren't clones. They actually produce these. Each female produces twice the number of chromosomes within those unfertilized eggs that develop into an embryo, and those chromosomes get recombined to form more genetically diverse offspring, just like they would in a fertilized egg, which is very different than classic parthenogenesis, where you get clones. And I'm certain that the New Mexico whiptail isn't the only species in which this happens. And then the other fun thing about them that I found out is that they sometimes simulate copulation with each other, which actually increases their fertility, with the lizard on the bottom producing bigger eggs than the lizard acting out sort of the male top role. But they're both
Mm-hmm.
females.
That I, science is yeah I think that's like I'm very like I think I'm like stuck in my head with that one, because I'm like science and these things, and there's some things that I will just never fully understand, even if there's full scientific papers of like why that functions. I know I will never fully understand the biology and the everything behind it. um but like yeah, that. I'm so what I don't know if you can explain more, but I feel like I need to know more because like what the like what does the if they are reproducing by themselves, is there some kind of like chemical passed between them? Is there some kind of pheromone that sets something off in the brain? Is there some kind of like what is it that makes the kind of simulated like sex that isn't actually doing any it's doing something but it's not doing yeah, do you know
Mhm.
why that is, like what that does? Like
I have absolutely no idea. I would imagine it's something hormonal,
mhm,
but yeah, I don't know. And I forget if the paper that wrote about that actually said
uh-huh.
why that was. Maybe that's someone's upcoming dissertation they can do.
I feel like what this episode is going to be is if we talk about more examples, I'm just going to get more and more just amazed, but confused, but also want to kind of start just handing out PhDs to people of like, somebody give me all of the funding in the world that I can just assign to people to go and work this stuff out because I'm really intrigued. But also,
The dream.
yeah, it's also the dream, but also I'm kind of like, maybe it is more magical as a mystery of like, we don't need to, like, that's interesting, like yeah, maybe I don't need to know, maybe I can just live happily. No, well, no, I can't, I'm too curious, I want to know, I need to know. um no, that's amazing. I feel like I feel like it's set the bar high in terms of like interesting things, but is there any like I can see that why that would be one of the standouts. Is there any others that you're like maybe that stand out as like significant or interesting in a different way?
Well, I mean, I think, one of the most famous examples that everybody knows this species is the clownfish, of which there are many, many species of clownfish. And clownfish are all born male and they change sex. And it's called functional hermaphrodism. And so basically there's one female in a group and a bunch of males of different sizes, and it's like a queue. So the largest male is the only one that breeds with the female, and then when that female dies or whatever happens to her, that largest male becomes the next female, and then the next male in line is the breeding male, and so on and so forth. And so, like, I like to joke that Finding Nemo was inaccurate
Mhm.
because Nemo's dad should have become Nemo's mom.
I feel like I've seen that somewhere before. Of like the like when you realize kind of the actual backstory of Clownfish, Finding Nemo becomes just a very different film of like. And I remember working in an aquarium like when I was younger. I remember that being a story that like amazed people because there was a couple species, and I think it's something that you see in a number of things. Right, is this ability to kind of dependent on the group dynamic and the kind of needs within the group, like this kind of change of like when a significant member dies, either kind of it like you'll get the large male becoming female or the large female becoming male, and like I think it was cuckoo wrasse is another one that like they live
Mm.
around there. I remember because it was in kind of the kind of aquarium that I worked in kind of celebrated the kind of they had clownfish and stuff, but they also celebrated species that were also around UK coastlines, and that was the one that like I think always made people intrigued, right? Because like people expect, I think, especially around the UK, everything to be grey and dark and boring when it comes to the ocean. But actually, like these bright orange fish that like will grow these like blue lines on their face will get actively quite a bit big. Like they're really like interesting, really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. It's a really good example, I think. And it always like the look on people's faces of like, as we've said, when people don't expect these kind of things and don't know about these things, the kind of like confusion, but also interest, but also kind of like I'm amazed, but like I can't believe this thing exists near me. But also, all of it is like really, really, really interesting, and kind of entertaining to watch. Mhm,
Yeah, and there's so many. I mean, gosh, fish are a great example
mhm.
of a taxa where there is a lot of sex changing and hermaphrodism.
Yeah. Hmm. I feel like there seems to be no like I think that's there's I think people go to an aquarium expecting to just look at pretty fish, and actually when they start to learn about them, they realize there's a lot of really interesting kind of stuff that happens under the sea when it comes to reproduction and everything that goes on. I think is like always amazes people, and also kind of, yeah. Is there any other under the sea kind of examples that you had off the top of your head that you're kind of like, this is an interesting one?
I have so many. Well, since you brought up the wrasse, like I find the
Mhm.
wrasse example to be really interesting. And this is like there's so many versions of this dynamic in different species of wrasse, of which there are many species. But I did a video on the blue streak cleaner wrasse, which it's I don't know if other wrasse do this, but it's a fish that eats parasites and dead tissue off of other fish. Um, and Normally it lives in these harems with a male and several females. So when the male dies, the biggest female takes his place and starts, courting other females and starts developing testes and all of that. Pretty soon becoming the new big male of the group. And actually, there's like a whole competitive thing within this species where the females will try to get the best juicy bits on the fish that they're cleaning and grow bigger than their male counterparts so they can eventually change sex and be that top male, which would be like an advantageous position to be in. And so that's like another example of sort of sequential hermaphrodism. But like the other cool thing about them is that apparently, if that newly minted male in a harem is challenged by another male, he can change right back to the female role where she'll kind of lay low until her next chance to be the top dude, you know? So like staying flexible is like a strategy for the wrasse, this particular species of wrasse. Outside of the fish world, there are so many things. I mean, just thinking about dolphins, um, a lot of dolphins are very sexual
Mhm.
and very
Mhm.
interested in bonding through sex and through mutual masturbation and all of these different things. Um, Actually, on that note, like it's a great time to throw in the fact that there have now been like a few theory papers about same-sex behavior in animals kind of put out, and so one of the ones that's related to what I was talking about with mammals is these authors from Spain, I think last year, did a whole review of where same-sex behavior has been documented across um, mammalia, basically, and they figured out that it has evolved many different times across that taxa, and that it's more likely within mammals to have emerged within like social species. So while I don't think that we need to say that every single thing has like some um, I don't know, reproductive purpose, like an evolutionary purpose of sort of having different types of social bonds of all different flavors and varieties, same sex and otherwise, is that social species do survive and persist better when they are cooperating and socializing with one another. So that's not that surprising that these behaviors have evolved within mammals to be like more in social mammals. And then there was like a whole other, a few years ago, actually, my friend Julia led this paper trying to basically proposing the theory that wait, why are we saying that same sex behavior is unusual? It makes more sense for same sex behavior to be the norm evolutionarily when, all these animals and also, everyone in our ancestry way back when in our ancestor species, there was a certain point, and still is for most, if not many species, where they can't tell each other apart. And if you can't do individual differentiation, how can you do heterosexual, like actively choose heterosexual behavior as sort of a, the most energetically friendly thing? Like that's not really likely. So she and her colleagues essentially proposed like the opposite theory. Like let's look at it a different way and say that heterosexual behavior probably emerged when sex differentiation was possible. And the basal normal way of being is indiscriminate sexual behavior. And so that's one of the theories. So it's just like a few different theory papers have popped up in the past 5 years that I think I'm excited to see what comes out of theory land coming forward.
I think it's really important, right? It's really interesting. I think it's like it's something that has come up a couple times this series, right? Is that like people have talked about the fact that like when because science and conservation and nature spaces have often been dominated by one type of person. Like when people who have not classically been allowed into the conservation and nature space or not been like considered, their views maybe have been dismissed, or like when these kind of different viewpoints are allowed to kind of flourish and encouraged to be there and allowed to be there and embraced, like it's not only like important for like the people and for like representation, it's important because science, when it is only done by one certain viewpoint, or maybe one, not to say every single person who has come in science, done science before, like has had exactly the same set of views, but like when it is classically a white middle class male field, like when different viewpoints are and theories and people and things are allowed to come into the space and just allowed to kind of sit and disrupt, I think it's like really interesting to see how these kind of things develop and how things change and how kind of, yeah, the space, it can kind of shift the entire way of thinking about something that has been so classically thought about in one particular way. And I think it's really, really interesting. And oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, what you're touching on is the fact that objectivity doesn't exist. There's actually a great book, and I'm sure many other great books, but this one is called Objectivity. And it's all about, how we come into any space we're in with some sort of lens. Even if we're trying to be the most quote unquote, like objective, non biased Western scientist, your funding comes from somewhere. The way you choose, the questions you choose to answer come from somewhere within you or from people who influence you. The way you choose to answer them and who you choose to involve in that, all of these elements, and that's just scratching the surface. And in fact, like just as a philosophical note, I think I and many others not only see the value ethically in bringing in multiple ways of knowing into science, but also the value for science itself to be a more holistic, comprehensive field by recognizing and not ignoring the nuance of like what objectivity is and is not, and seeing where how positionality feeds into our science is almost like a requirement. And we've done for many, many, many years, Western science has done a disservice to itself by not allowing that to be acknowledged.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's, yeah, but it's, yeah, and it's something that like I feel like now I spend, like doing a PhD, I spend a lot of my time just sitting like the research and the research questions and these things are like and doing the kind of field work and doing these things is very, very important, but also that kind of critical reflection and sitting on these questions of like, why am I getting these answers? But like especially when I'm, I guess, like when I'm interacting with people or asking people questions or asking people things, how does the way that I present myself to the world, how does the way that I appear to the world, how does the way that I kind of like ask the questions, even the papers that have informed me, how do all of these things go into constructing or like shaping the answers that I end up getting is something that like I think is so critically important. I think what's like really interesting is like going into and working with certain conservation organizations, like I've like had to be the one to like I've used the word positionality, and like I've then had they've stopped me and be like, what do you mean by that? And it's interesting that like this discussion is now happening. It's always good when somebody asks the question because I'm like, now go away and think about that and think about like how that might have informed or changed, because it's such an important part of everything I think that we do, and like it's something that is it shapes all of these things and all of these things that we kind of maybe take for granted or have not really questioned. Is really, really, really interesting. And I guess it kind of it moves almost onto a question that I was going to ask, which is about kind of bringing more people into space. What would you say to people who like don't feel comfortable or haven't felt comfortable in the kind of conservation space? But before I do that, is there any other kind of stories or little quick fun facts, things you wanted to highlight before I move on to that next question, that like you were like, I talked about the wrasse and the clownfish and like the lizards, but I also wanted to mention this thing as well?
The lesbian seagulls.
I was thinking about birds as well, so I'm glad you've said birds because, like, yep. Sorry, yes.
I don't like to use the word seagulls, but that's what people use, and it's kind of fun
Hmm.
to say lesbian seagulls. But a famous case. There's a lot of interesting press around it from the 70s when this
Hmm.
happened. Um, there were two scientists married to each other that
Hmm.
were studying on an island off the coast of California, Santa Barbara Island. And Molly Hunt, one of the scientists, started to notice that there were a lot of pairs of two females instead of hetero pairs. So I think they calculated there were like 14% of Western gull pairs at that time were female female couples. And like they were tipped off by this because they had these huge supernormal clutches of eggs that they were able to successfully hatch and fledge, which is really cool. Giving you some food for thought around like how same-sex couples could, maybe increase a population with one another. They stayed together long term, season after season, and it became this whole news thing. People getting really upset about like the goals, and I think also had a little bit of a role or maybe a fundamental role for as part of the gay rights movement for some future court rulings as well. I think like Lawrence versus Texas, which was around sodomy or something else like that, um, where like they were able to use like these data to be like, hey, it's not unnatural. Which again, like we hark back to the very first thing I said of like we should not have to do that. And there are probably a lot of problematic avenues with doing that. But nonetheless, in the 70s and beyond, these goals were actually pretty key.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really, yeah, that is really interesting, and like I feel like, yeah, we need to talk about those gulls more because I feel like people now just see seagulls like and just hate them because of they steal food and they do this and the next thing. But actually, there's an interesting story there that I am going to tell every time somebody in my life complains about seagulls making too much noise or being aggressive or being this, that, and the next thing. That's very interesting, and I think it's interesting as well. Like I love looking at these stories of it is something that I think pops up in a number of species, right? Of like, if, for example, uh, like a pair of like a gull, like I think it's albatross is another one where like, yeah, if something the male abandons the nest and or like they pair up and there's for whatever reason like yeah they two females, two males, two whatever will look after an egg and hopefully try and like raise it. I think like it always makes me smile, like thinking about I work part time for RZSS in here in Scotland, and they have penguins, and in the spring all the penguin chicks hatch, and like you'll get the like last year I think it was my one of the my favorite of all the penguins. He is called Snowflake. He has not albin is not he's not albino. He has like the what's the it's gone out of my head. He has white. His all of his feathers are white, basically. Uh,
Cystic.
that's the one. Yes. So he stands out anyway as like fantastic and brilliant and love him. Last year, he didn't pair up with one of the female penguins. He paired up with Mr. Spain, and he was living his best life. And as that wasn't only the sweetest love story I've ever seen, they did this thing where like they obviously like penguins gather rocks for their nests to create these kind of spaces where they would lay eggs. Mr. Spain and Snowflake happened to pick like they got like I think it was the children's hospital in Edinburgh painted these rocks to go in so they could see like oh like I've painted a bee on mine, I've painted Mr. Spain and Snowflake picked the rock that had a rainbow painted on it and brought it to their nest. And I was like, you two, like these birds
It's
are
amazing.
icons and I love them. And like, yeah. So yeah, the fact that we got the bird mention in there, I think is very, very important. And yeah, I'm glad Snowflake's getting his representation as well. Like, well, I managed to shoehorn him into the series is basically what I'm saying. But thank you for opening that door because yeah, it's really, really interesting. And yeah, good old birds. I feel like we don't talk about them enough on the show. So if there's any bird experts out there who have other species they want to talk about, come and message me or do something because they're always doing interesting things and clearly very important things as well. If they are helping changing law or standing up in court cases and things, that's really, really, yeah, really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. Um, I feel like I really don't want to end this conversation because I feel like I like want to just keep hearing more and more of these examples and things. But I think we should return to the question that I almost asked a second ago, because we kind of got really close to answering it, which is this thing of like every episode this series, what I've been doing is trying to ask like if there's somebody out there who's listening to this who feels like they don't belong or their voice doesn't matter in the conservation space or they shouldn't be in that this kind of nature space. I've been asking every guest, like, what would you say to that person right now of like to either encourage them or to, yeah, like, what would you say to that person who feels like maybe they don't belong in this conservation or nature space?
Well, I mean, in short, you do belong. And not only do you belong, we need diversity of thought and experience in order to not only bring that thought to the table and help conserve species, but conservation takes people, right? So we need all of those diversity of experiences to relate to one another, to better relate to one another, to relate to the folks who are making conservation choices on the ground. I find that being a very intersectional person myself, lots of different identities within one, and a lot of hardship in my life, has actually helped me to do better conservation work. Even though when I grew up, I didn't see any conservationists that looked like me or, that weren't like sort of cis white dudes. And I didn't have any clue how to get into the space. Now, I think there is a lot more representation. There's a lot more recognition of why representation is important, and not just for encouraging folks from underrepresented backgrounds to join in on conservation space, but also to make conservation a more robust and lasting and sustainable endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think yeah, there's the perfect answer. I think, and like yeah, I think yeah, thank you for reflecting on your own experience and sharing it because I think it's an important thing to kind of let people know that like yeah, these things can yeah are really important, are really important, and I think it's a really important message to like yeah get out there. And I hope it's the last obviously episode of the series, and I hope that like throughout all of these episodes, people have picked up different things, but I think you have summed up really nicely and concisely there for that last like thing of like yeah we need these things, it makes everything better, like yeah, really perfectly summed up, which I think is yeah a really nice message I think for the last episode. I think really nice. um Another question that I've been asking everybody is, as always, and I mean, we can link it back to another one of the species maybe we didn't get to touch on, is what is their favorite underappreciated species? Now, you were on the show, you've had, I can't, what was it you said the last time? I should have looked this up. So we talked about hyenas, but you will have said something else. So I wonder if you would, like, I should have looked up what you said last time I asked you this was. Anyway, what I'm asking everybody is, what is your favorite underappreciated species? What would you like if people are intrigued and want to go away and don't already have enough to think about? Which I think we've raised many questions this episode, but like if they don't have enough to think about already, what species should they go and learn more about? What's your favorite underappreciated one?
Okay, it's actually way too hard. I,
Yep.
I probably said spotted hyenas last
Uh-huh.
time,
Mm-hmm.
because they are fantastic and also a bit queer. Um, but to not be a broken record, because everyone knows my favorite species is spotted hyenas. Um, the thing that got me started, honestly, I'm going to say two more. So the thing that got me started was rats. I was super in love with the New York City rats because I grew up in Queens. And they are just so resilient and so clever. In fact, most misunderstood and maybe underappreciated species that live alongside us are actually just misunderstood because they're resilient to what we humans throw at them. They're able to survive and sometimes even thrive anyway, and then end up like sort of pissing us off because of their resilience and cleverness. So
Mm-hmm.
I find rats to be really fascinating, underappreciated, and more nuanced than you would think. And then to throw in a weird one, I would say the Fossa, which is some people call the Fossa. Fossa is a mammal from Madagascar that is very unique, very weird, actually a little queer. They exhibit transient masculinity. The females, when they're young, grow sort of like male like genitalia for a little while, and then that disappears and becomes female-like, and people don't really know why, but they think it could be maybe to help them with like the aggression they need to, and like the sort of maybe hiding from being attacked by males, that they need to disperse and make their own territory. Or I don't think they know yet, but it's so interesting that they just sort of like become adolescently male like for a while, and then like sort of are like, actually, I'm going to change into being female because I don't need that anymore. And also, I just think that everything in Madagascar is fascinating, and I know very little about it.
Yeah. This is, I end up, I think most of, I think if we look back through the episodes, there's actually now more episodes about species from Madagascar than there is about any other kind of place in the world, because we've talked chameleons, we've talked the hundreds of lemurs, we've talked about like all sorts of things, because there's like so many, like, there's something going on there, that they are just special and wonderful and interesting creatures just seem to live on that, like in that place is amazing. And yes, I love how you got the kind of, yeah, you brought it back to the theme, which I really like. And also, I mean, if you would like a brief moment to say, because you did give a teaser of hyenas are a little bit queer. So if you would like to say why, then you are more than welcome to, because otherwise we're going to leave the listeners with too much of a cliffhanger. Like if you would like to say what it is, then I would also like to know.
All right. A lot of reasons, but the main ones I'd say are that females, in their highly complex social structure in spotted hyenas, females are usually the highest ranked above all the males. They're usually bigger on average than the males, and they kind of call all the shots, right? They get the best cuts of meat, etc. Typically, it's a matrilineal society, so you can inherit your rank from your mom, your social rank. But the queerest thing about them is that females have a giant clitoris, or a pseudophallus, as people like to call it, because they get really worried about saying clitoris. Um, and and their clitoris actually becomes erect. It's the same size as the male's penis.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
And it's, unless you know what you're looking for, it can be pretty difficult to tell them apart. Especially because females also have a pseudo scrotum that has nothing in it, but it looks like a scrotum to some extent. So I've actually had to teach. I taught a veterinarian once when we had captured a young female who hadn't given birth, so it wasn't super obvious. She didn't have her nipples prominent or anything like that. I had to show this vet that this was a female, because he saw the pseudoscrotum and was like, this must be a male. And so because of this, everybody's got a penis essentially. The females essentially call all the shots for sex. They have all the control over mate choice, along with their social rank, allowing them to have that control. And their genitalia is just super strange. Like they pee, have sex, and give birth through their clitoris. They have an internal vagina. So it's a wild ride over there in hyena land.
Mm-hmm. And I am so glad I asked that, because that is the final fact that is going to be given in the series of like this series. And I think nothing is more perfect of an ending to this series than that. Like that is so interesting and so wonderful. And like, yeah, I think, yeah, like a really interesting thing to leave people thinking about, and like a perfect example. I think we've now covered like land, sea, sky, and then hyenas have just come atop it all of like, this is now like, yeah, this is a really interesting thing, and a perfect example of, yeah, the whole argument that queer is natural, the whole, like, every fact that we've given summed up perfectly in hyena land, as you say. Like, so interesting, so interesting. And now I'm going to re-listen to the hyena episode we recorded a while ago with a whole new lens and perspective, thinking about it again, going like, yeah, like this changes everything. This changes everything. No, that's really, really interesting. And I guess then that kind of brings us on to the kind of final question that I have, which is like, if people want to learn more, I know, like, is there anything you would like to promote? Is there anything you'd like to talk about? Is like people can go follow you, learn more about your work, learn more about like things that you're doing. Yeah, is there anything you wanted to chat about there?
Yeah, sure. If you want to keep up with the Queer is Natural video series, you can view it on TikTok. My handle is the Scrappy Naturalist, or on Instagram, which maybe will be linked. And those have been posted in concentration every June since 2022, but also sort of in between. I just did one on whales a couple of weeks ago. And you could also visit my website, scrappynaturalist.com, to find all of the different socials if you lose track of everything I'm saying. And then really good timing coming up really soon. I was featured along with several other fine folk on a documentary special called Queer Planet, which was created by Plimsoll Productions, and it's going to be streaming on Peacock in the USA starting on June 6th. It's all about these topics, also featuring fungi, actually bringing in some other taxa. And it's actually been out in several other countries since last year. I'm not sure if it's still streaming in those countries, but places like the UK and Spain, Australia, Canada, it came out last year. So if you're in one of those countries, take a look around.
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll do a search around now, and when I'm writing the description of this, and try and find like in the UK where I am, like where I can find it, like, and yeah, see if there's a
That'd
list
be
or
great,
something.
actually.
I'll put a link to as many things as I can find in the description, including the website and social media and everything. And yes, and I will put obviously a link to all of our socials down there as well. So if you happen to be on these things, we're at Pangolin Podcast on everything, so you can give us a follow as well. And I guess with all of that said, oh, and also while you're here, you can subscribe to the podcast, leave us a nice review. There are 6 other episodes that have come out this month, all about wonderful, wonderful things, featuring wonderful, wonderful people. We've talked gibbons, sloths, comms, being a vet. We've talked about fire. We've talked about all kinds of interesting things that we have not covered on the show before in our celebration of kind of Pride. And so, yes, make sure to subscribe and go back and listen to all of those if you haven't already, because if you've just listened to this is just the tip of the iceberg of all of the other amazing things that we've talked about. So it's like there's so much there for you to unpack and learn, and so many other voices to hear. It's fantastic. So go back and have a look and see. And having said all that, and done all that promo and done all those things, I guess that brings us to the very last thing that I have to say, which is, of course, a huge thank you to all of the listeners, of course, for listening and for supporting the show this whole month. It's been fantastic to see the responses and hear the nice things and wonderful things that you've learned and, like, yeah, shown love for so many amazing people and things. So thank you for all of that. But of course, also thank you to you, Christine, for your time, for being here again, and for giving me reasons that I think facts and things that are going to keep me up at night until I know the answer of, because I'm now just intrigued by it all. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
No, it's been absolutely brilliant. And on that note, for the final time this series, thank you all so much for listening, and goodbye.